If World War III started tomorrow, where would you run? Is there really any place on Earth that could guarantee your safety, or is that just a fantasy fueled by movies and internet myths? Let's find out together, because what you're about to discover might change how you see the whole idea of safe zones in a global conflict. Today we're going deep into the facts and the myths. We'll look at the countries everyone calls untouchable, like Iceland, New Zealand, and Switzerland, but we won't just repeat what you've heard 100 times. We'll break down what really makes a place safer than others, the real criteria according to experts in history, and the lessons you can use no matter where you live. And stick with me, because at the end, I'll share the single biggest signal nobody talks about, and why the safest place might not be where you expect. First things first, there's no such thing as absolute safety in a global war. But some places are undeniably safer than others, and it's not just about geography or borders on a map. Experts from FEMA, the Federation of American Scientists, and even Swiss Civil Defense Studies agree on a few key factors. The first is geography. Are you far from major military powers or right next to them? Then there's political neutrality. History shows that countries like Switzerland have survived major conflicts not just by hiding behind mountains, but by staying out of alliances and hosting international organizations. Another big factor is strategic value. If your country has oil, critical ports, or major military bases, it's much more likely to become a target. Population density and urbanization matter too. The less crowded, the less likely you are to be affected by fallout, infrastructure collapse, or resource shortages. But here's the catch. Most people can't just pack up and move to a neutral island. Passports, money, family, and laws all play a role. That's why, for most of us, the real question is, how can I apply these lessons right where I live? Let me ask you, do you think it's more important to be far from military targets, or to live in a place with local food and water security? Drop your thoughts in the comments and help build this community's knowledge. Let's talk honestly about the places that always show up on those safest in WW3 lists. You see them everywhere: Iceland, New Zealand, Australia, Switzerland, Bhutan, and sometimes places like Chile, Uruguay, or remote Pacific islands. But let's pull back the curtain and see what really makes these countries seem untouchable and what their real limits are. Because sometimes what sounds safest is just a mix of geography, perception, and good marketing. Let's start with Iceland, the top pick on almost every survival list. Why? Iceland has no standing army, it's isolated by the North Atlantic, and it's not part of any military alliance that would automatically make it a target for nuclear or conventional strikes. Add to that its lack of critical resources or high-value industry, and you get a country that's largely invisible in war planning. During the Cold War, even with the US Navy stationed at Keflavik, Iceland remained outside the immediate range of most war scenarios. Today, it's seen as the ultimate off-the-radar safe haven. But the reality is a bit less perfect. As both the BBC and Bloomberg have pointed out in coverage of Iceland's pandemic response and global crises, Iceland depends heavily on global shipping for fuel, medicine, and even many foods. If global supply chains collapsed, Iceland's isolation would be a challenge, not an advantage. With just over 350,000 people and limited domestic production, the island couldn't support a major influx of refugees or expats. In other words, its safety comes from being small and overlooked. But those same factors mean resources are extremely limited if things go wrong. If you've ever thought about moving there, ask yourself, how would you actually get in? And how long could you really last? Next, New Zealand and Australia. These two always make the list for similar reasons. Distance from the Northern Hemisphere's main conflict zones, strong agriculture, relatively low strategic value in a NATO-Russia confrontation. New Zealand in particular is famous for its nuclear-free stance and historic neutrality, even refusing nuclear-powered ships entry since the 1980s, a fact regularly highlighted by Reuters and the New Zealand Herald. But let's not forget, New Zealand is remote, and while that helps avoid fallout, it also means the country is highly dependent on imports for fuel, advanced medicine, and many manufactured goods. Isolation protects, but it also complicates survival if shipping and air links are cut. Australia, on the other hand, is less neutral than people think. As the BBC and Defense One have reported, it's a key U.S. ally, hosts important intelligence and satellite tracking stations like Pine Gap, and has been involved in every major Western coalition of the past decades. That means Australia could be considered a secondary target in a global conflict, especially if things spill beyond Europe or Asia. Australia's vast size means some rural areas would stay safe even during a major war, but key cities and strategic sites are a different story. Then there's Switzerland, legendary for its neutrality and extensive bunker system. It's almost a cliche. The one country where every citizen, even today, legally has access to shelter space. During the Cold War, Switzerland prepared for the worst, building an entire national network of underground bunkers, as documented by the Swiss Federal Office for Civil Protection and reported by Foreign Affairs. Strict neutrality kept it out of both world wars, and the country became synonymous with safe haven. But modern Swiss experts and government advisors now admit that in today's globalized, interconnected world, even Switzerland could be hit indirectly. Fallout doesn't respect borders, and the economic shock of a full-scale war could send millions of refugees streaming across the Alps, putting huge pressure on Swiss society and resources. Switzerland might avoid direct attack, but it can't isolate itself from the world's crises as easily as it once did. What about Bhutan? The Himalayan kingdom is often mentioned for its remote location, tiny population, and policy of gross national happiness. It lacks strategic targets, avoids most global entanglements, and is far from any known nuclear arsenal. But the reality is more complicated. Bhutan is sandwiched between China and India, two of the world's largest, most heavily armed states, each with unresolved territorial disputes. If conflict ever broke out between Beijing and New Delhi, Bhutan would be right in the path, as shown in past border skirmishes. Neutrality is a strength, but geography can override even the best intentions. If you're considering the Himalayas, think twice about what being in the middle of nowhere really means if the great powers come knocking. Let's look at South America, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay. These countries are off the radar for most military planners, far from NATO, Russia, China, and major nuclear stockpiles. They're self-sufficient in food and water, as the Food and Agriculture Organization has noted, and are less likely to become direct battlegrounds. During the World Wars, South America was a haven for many fleeing violence in Europe. However, the region isn't immune to the ripple effects of a global conflict. As shown during the COVID-19 pandemic, when shipping and air travel were disrupted, even these countries struggled with shortages. Their economies are tightly bound to global trade, and most can't handle a sudden flood of outsiders. And while remote regions like Patagonia are beautiful and empty, they're also tough for outsiders to reach, survive in, or legally settle in without local ties. And then, the classic remote Pacific Island fantasy. It sounds like a dream. No major targets, surrounded by ocean, minimal fallout risk. But access is the real challenge. As the New York Times and several global security reports point out, many of these islands are tiny, have minimal infrastructure, and can only be reached by long-range boat or specialized flights. Survival there depends on local knowledge, supplies, and sometimes just luck. If you've ever watched a doomsday movie, remember, most Pacific islands aren't easy to reach, and surviving long-term without strong local networks is a serious gamble. So what does all this mean for the average person? It means that while some places are statistically safer, there is no such thing as a perfect safe zone. The factors that matter most, distance from major powers, political neutrality, self-sufficiency, are always relative, and every option comes with trade-offs. And of course, not everyone can just move to the other side of the world, get residency, or afford the costs of starting over. These countries are examples, not prescriptions. The real lesson isn't to run for Iceland. It's to understand why these places are considered safe and see what lessons you can apply at home. But let's make it practical. Are any of these countries on your personal safe list? Or maybe you have a different idea, somewhere nobody talks about, but you think is actually safer. Tell me your reasons in the comments. You never know, your insight could help someone make a smarter plan. But there's more to safety than just where you are on the map. Coming up, let's see how natural barriers, resource security, and local networks could make the difference, sometimes even more than being in a so-called untouchable country. So, if you can't move to Iceland, what can you do? The reality is, the same principles that make a country safer on a big scale also apply locally. First, distance from strategic targets. If you live near a major city, military base, or infrastructure like refineries or rail hubs, your risk is higher. If you can move, even temporarily, consider relocating to a more rural area or at least away from the highest value targets. Second, local self-sufficiency is huge. Studies by the United Nations and even FEMA suggest that communities with strong local food systems, clean water, and mutual aid networks bounce back faster from any disaster, war included. Natural barriers matter more than most people think. Mountain ranges, wide rivers, deserts, and even dense forests can slow down the spread of conflict, fallout, or waves of refugees. That's why some of the safest places in both world wars were rural valleys, mountain villages, or isolated coastlines, not because they were neutral, but because they were hard to reach. Social ties and local community are also critical. In every conflict, people with strong networks, friends, neighbors, extended family, do better. They share resources, defend their area, and help each other adapt. The American Red Cross and Swiss Civil Defense manuals both emphasize that in a crisis, community matters more than any wall or bunker. What about shelters? You might have seen our previous video on building a nuclear bunker. The truth is, a well-constructed shelter can dramatically improve your chances if you're in the fallout zone or near a target, but it's not a magic solution. The best approach is a combination. Maximize your distance from danger, improve your local readiness, and, if possible, have access to a safe room or shelter. Even an improvised shelter using earth, concrete, or even books and water barrels can reduce exposure. If you can't leave your country, focus on what you can control, where you live, who you know, how much you prepare. What's the one thing you wish you could change about your current location? Let's talk about it in the comments and maybe crowdsource some solutions. So far, we've seen that geography and politics matter. But preparation and local choices are just as powerful. But what about the biggest myths and the mistakes that can put you at risk, even if you think you're safe? Here's where a lot of people go wrong. They think that country X is neutral, so I'm fine. Or, I'll just get on a plane if something happens. In reality, the first hours of a major conflict are the most dangerous for travel. Airports close, borders go up, and global panic sets in. History is full of examples, from Yugoslavia to Syria to Ukraine, where the first wave of refugees had it the hardest. Another myth is the idea that a last-minute move will save you. In truth, the safest people are those who plan ahead, build local ties, and know their area. That doesn't mean you need to dig a bunker or live in fear, but it does mean thinking practically, storing some extra water and food, knowing your evacuation routes, building relationships with neighbors. The last big mistake? Believing the internet's top 5 safest countries lists without thinking critically. As we've seen, no place is perfect, and the world changes fast. What was safe 10 years ago might not be today. That's why the only real safe zone is a combination of place, preparation, and adaptability. Have you ever believed a myth about safety in global crises? What changed your mind? Drop your story below. Someone might need to hear it. But now let's flip the script. Is there a signal, something real and practical that actually predicts where you'd be safest, even more than all the lists and theories? You might be surprised. Here's the part almost nobody discusses. According to recent research from the Federation of American Scientists and studies published in Nature and Foreign Affairs, the places that survive global crises best are those that combine 4 things: local resource security, strong community networks, low strategic value, and adaptability. It's not just about being off the map. It's about having a balance, enough connection to the world for information and trade, but not so much that you become a primary target. Take Finland, for example. For decades, it was on the front line of the Cold War, but it invested heavily in shelters, local resilience, and emergency planning. Even today, every new building in Helsinki must include a bomb shelter by law. Or look at rural areas in Canada, the US Midwest, or Argentina. Low targets, plenty of resources, and tight-knit communities. But there's a wild card. Climate change is shifting the map of safety. Areas that were once ideal, like the American Southwest, now face water shortages and heat waves. Some experts believe the safest areas in the future could be places with moderate climates, reliable rainfall, and low population. Think parts of New Zealand, Patagonia, or even the northern US. The real lesson is this: you don't need to chase the perfect country. You need to build the safest situation possible with the resources and connections you have. And you need to keep adapting as the world changes. Let's bring it all together. There may not be a single untouchable country, but there are definitely places, and even more, strategies, that can keep you and your loved ones safer in a global crisis. Focus on what you can control: your location, your network, your preparation, your mindset. If you've made it this far, you're not just scrolling. You're someone who thinks ahead and looks for real answers, not myths. So let's make this community even stronger. Where would you go if you had to choose? Or if you can't move, what's your best move right where you are? Share your thoughts in the comments.